My boss scheduled my performance review during my dad's funeral and says I'm not committed enough. I was standing in the funeral home parking lot, still wearing my black suit, when my phone buzzed with the calendar notification. Performance review, Gerald Thornton. 2:00 p.m., the same time I'd be delivering my father's eulogy. I stared at the screen, certain it was a glitch, some cruel algorithmic mistake. Then the follow-up email arrived. David, I noticed you haven't confirmed our 2 p.m. meeting. Your continued absence from scheduled reviews reflects poorly on your commitment to the team. Please confirm by noon, or we'll need to discuss your priorities. My hands started shaking, and not from the November cold. My father's casket was being wheeled into the chapel 50 feet away, and my boss was threatening my job because I hadn't confirmed a meeting scheduled during his funeral. I told Gerald 3 weeks ago that my father was dying. I told him 2 weeks ago when we moved Dad to hospice. I'd told him 5 days ago when Dad passed. I'd sent the obituary link. I'd forwarded the funeral home details to HR. And somehow, Gerald had looked at all of that information and decided that Wednesday afternoon at 2 p.m., the exact moment I'd be standing at a podium talking about my father's 63 years on this planet, was the perfect time to evaluate my quarterly performance metrics. I'd worked at Stratford Analytics for 8 years, longer than anyone else on the development team. I'd built half the infrastructure that kept the company's data pipeline running. I'd trained 4 generations of junior developers. I'd worked through weekends, holidays, my own wedding anniversary because Gerald said the client needed it. I'd believed in the company culture, the mission statement about work-life balance, the employee handbook that promised compassion during family emergencies. My father had been proud of my career. He'd been a machinist his whole life, hands always scarred, and oil-stained. And he'd loved that his son worked in a clean office, wore button-down shirts, used his brain instead of destroying his body. When I got promoted to senior developer 3 years ago, Dad had actually cried. He'd taken my business card and kept it in his wallet, showing it to his friends at the VFW. My son, the computer engineer, he'd say, even though I'd corrected him a dozen times about the proper title. Now that card was probably still in his wallet, in the pocket of the suit we'd buried him in, and my boss was demanding I prove my commitment to a company that couldn't show basic human decency during my grief. The backstory made it worse. Gerald Thornton had been hired as VP of Technology 18 months ago, brought in from a Silicon Valley startup that had burned through $60 million in venture capital before collapsing. He'd arrived with buzzwords and aggressive management techniques, immediately implementing mandatory daily stand-ups, weekly one-on-ones, monthly performance reviews, and quarterly commitment assessments. The old guard hated him. The new hires feared him. He'd fired 3 people in his first 6 months, always for vague reasons like cultural fit or insufficient drive. He'd created an environment where people came in sick, worked through family emergencies, answered emails at midnight to prove their dedication. When Priya's mother had a stroke, Gerald had asked if she could maybe do some remote work from the hospital, since the sprint deadline was approaching. When James had requested paternity leave, Gerald had approved the minimum required by law and then given him a negative performance review for taking extended time during a critical project phase. I'd watched it happen and told myself it wouldn't happen to me. I was valuable. I was irreplaceable. I had 8 years of institutional knowledge and technical expertise Gerald couldn't replace in 6 months of hiring. I was wrong. The warning signs had been there for months, but I'd rationalized every single one. 3 months ago, Gerald had scheduled a performance review during my anniversary dinner. I'd mentioned it weeks in advance, had it marked on the shared team calendar, but Gerald had put the meeting on my schedule anyway. I need flexibility in my calendar, he'd said when I tried to reschedule. If you can't accommodate that, maybe you're not as committed as I thought. I'd canceled the dinner reservation. My wife had been understanding, but I could see the disappointment in her eyes. 2 months ago, he'd scheduled a mandatory team strategy session on a Saturday morning, the same Saturday I'd planned to help my mother move furniture after Dad got too weak to do it himself. I'd shown up to the strategy session. Mom had hired movers instead, paying money she didn't have because her son was too afraid of his boss to help her. 6 weeks ago, Gerald had called me at 11:30 p.m. on a Friday night, demanding I fix a production bug. That could have waited until Monday. I'd been at the hospital with my father, who'd just been admitted with complications. I'd excused myself from Dad's room, found an empty waiting area, and spent 90 minutes on my laptop fixing code, while my father lay in a hospital bed wondering where I'd gone. Each time, I'd told myself it was just Gerald's management style, that he was demanding but fair, that if I just proved myself enough, he'd ease up. Each time, I'd been wrong. The funeral director was waving at me from the chapel entrance. My mother was probably wondering where I'd gone. My sister was inside, trying to hold it together for Mom's sake. And I was in a parking lot, staring at an Outlook calendar reminder that made my blood pressure spike so high I could feel it pounding in my temples. I called Gerald's direct line. It rang 4 times before going to voicemail. Gerald, it's David. I'm at my father's funeral right now. The performance review is scheduled during the service. I sent you the funeral details last week. I need you to reschedule this immediately. My voice was shaking. I hung up and went inside to bury my father, trying to focus on the memories and the grief and the family surrounding me, but that calendar notification kept flashing in my mind like a neon sign. During the eulogy, while I was talking about Dad's service in Vietnam and his 40 years at the machine shop and the way he'd taught me to fix cars in our driveway, my phone buzzed 3 times in my pocket. I knew it was Gerald. I knew it was work. I knew my father would have told me to ignore it, to be present, to honor this moment. But I also knew that Gerald Thornton had the power to destroy the career my father had been so proud of, and that knowledge poisoned everything. After the service, after the burial, after the reception at Mom's house where people I hadn't seen in 20 years told me stories about my dad, I finally checked my phone. 7 emails from Gerald. The first one, time-stamped at 2:03 p.m., 3 minutes after our scheduled meeting. David, you missed our performance review. This is unacceptable. The second, at 2:15 p.m. I've noted your absence in your file. We'll need to discuss this pattern of deprioritizing company commitments. The third, at 2:47 p.m. I've rescheduled your review for tomorrow morning at 8 a.m. This is mandatory. Failure to attend will result in formal disciplinary action. The others were variations on the same theme, each one more threatening than the last. The final email, sent at 4:30 p.m., included HR in the CC line. David has demonstrated a concerning pattern of unavailability during critical review periods. Despite multiple attempts to accommodate his schedule, he has consistently failed to make himself available for required managerial check-ins. I am recommending we initiate a performance improvement plan to address these ongoing commitment issues. I read that email 3 times, sitting in my childhood bedroom that still had my high school baseball trophies on the shelf, and something inside me broke. Not broke, like shattered, broke like a dam releasing years of pressure. I didn't sleep that night. I lay in my old bed, staring at the ceiling, and I did something I should have done months ago. I started documenting. I went through every email Gerald had sent me, every calendar invitation, every Slack message, every performance review. I created a spreadsheet with dates, times, and content. I found the email I'd sent 3 weeks ago. Gerald, I wanted to inform you that my father has been diagnosed with stage 4 pancreatic cancer. His prognosis is poor, likely weeks rather than months. I may need to take some time off as his condition deteriorates. I wanted to give you advance notice so we can plan accordingly. Gerald's response, sent 47 minutes later. Noted. Please ensure all project documentation is up to date in case of unexpected absences. No condolences. No, I'm sorry to hear that. Just a reminder to document my work in case I died or my father did. I found the email from 2 weeks ago. Gerald, my father has been moved to hospice care. The doctors say it's a matter of days. I'll need to take bereavement leave when the time comes. Gerald's response. We'll cross that bridge when we get there. In the meantime, the Johnson Project needs your attention. I found the email from 5 days ago, sent at 11:43 p.m. from the hospice facility. Gerald, my father passed away this evening at 9:15 p.m. I'll need to take bereavement leave starting tomorrow to handle arrangements. The funeral will be on Wednesday, November 15th. I'll be back in the office the following Monday. Gerald's response, sent at 6:22 a.m. the next morning. Condolences. Please note we have your performance review scheduled for Wednesday at 2 p.m. If you need to reschedule, please suggest alternative times this week. I'd sent the funeral details. I'd sent the obituary link. I'd explained. It was at 2 p.m. on Wednesday, and he'd scheduled the review anyway. But the documentation went deeper than just my father's death. I found emails from 8 months ago when my wife had emergency surgery for appendicitis. I'd taken 2 days off, come back on the 3rd day still exhausted, and Gerald had pulled me into his office to express concern about my recent absences. I found calendar invitations from 6 months ago when Gerald had scheduled 3 performance reviews in 2 weeks, each one finding new problems with my work that had never been issues before. I found Slack messages where Gerald had publicly criticized my code in the development channel, then privately messaged me to say he was just keeping standards high. I found performance reviews that contradicted each other. 1 month I was exceeding expectations, the next I was failing to demonstrate sufficient initiative. I found a pattern of escalating demands and moving goalposts. Every time I met a standard, Gerald raised it. Every time I completed a project, he found reasons it wasn't good enough. Every time I asked for clarification on expectations, he told me I should figure it out, and that senior developers don't need hand-holding. The documentation filled 37 pages when I printed it out. Dates, times, direct quotes, context. I highlighted patterns. I cross-referenced company policy. I found 18 separate instances where Gerald had violated the employee handbook's provisions about reasonable accommodation, respectful communication, and bereavement leave. I worked on it until 4 a.m., until my eyes burned and my hands cramped from typing. Then I took a shower, put on my suit, and drove to the office. I showed up to the office at 8 a.m. on Thursday morning, 43 minutes before the mandatory performance review. I'd been awake for 36 hours. I'd drunk enough coffee to kill a smaller man. I'd printed every email, every Slack message, every calendar invitation. I'd organized it chronologically. I'd highlighted the relevant passages. I'd created a timeline. I walked past my desk, past the development bullpen where Priya gave me a sympathetic look, straight to HR. Diane Kowalski, Director of Human Resources, 14 years with the company, had an open-door policy that she actually meant. I knocked anyway. She looked up from her computer, saw my face, and immediately said, "Close the door and sit down." I handed her the documentation. "I need you to read this before my performance review in 40 minutes. All of it. Then I need you to be in that room with me and Gerald." She started reading. I watched her expression change. Confusion, then disbelief, then something that looked like anger carefully controlled by professional training. She read every page. It took 28 minutes. When she finished, she looked at me and said, "This performance review isn't happening. Not today. Not without legal counsel present." She picked up her phone and called someone. "Thomas, it's Diane. I need you in my office immediately. We have a situation." Thomas Ashford arrived 12 minutes later. Corporate counsel, Georgetown Law, 23 years practicing employment law. Diane handed him the documentation. He read it standing up, his face getting progressively tighter. When he finished, he said, "Where's Thornton now?" I checked the time. Probably waiting in the conference room for our 8:30 meeting. The walk to the conference room felt like a death march, but in reverse. I was walking toward vindication instead of execution. My hands were still shaking. My heart was hammering so hard I could feel it in my throat. Part of me was terrified that Thomas and Diane would back down once we faced Gerald, that authority would protect authority, that my documentation wouldn't matter against the VP of Technology's version of events. Part of me knew that wasn't rational, that HR and legal don't show up to performance reviews, unless something is very wrong, but fear doesn't care about rationality. Gerald was sitting at the head of the conference table when we walked in, exactly as I'd pictured him. Laptop open, documents spread out, a yellow legal pad with notes he'd prepared about my failures. He looked up when the three of us entered together, and I saw the flash of confusion cross his face, followed quickly by irritation. He didn't stand up. He didn't acknowledge Thomas or Diane. He looked directly at me and said, "You're 2 minutes late. This is exactly the kind of behavior we need to discuss." Thomas closed the door. The click of the lock was the most satisfying sound I'd ever heard. Thomas Ashford's first words when we walked into the conference room were, "Mr. Thornton, this meeting is being conducted under legal supervision. Anything discussed here may be used in formal proceedings. Do you understand?" Gerald looked confused, then irritated. He'd been sitting at the head of the table, my performance review documents spread out in front of him, a laptop open to what I assumed was a list of my failures and shortcomings. He looked at Thomas, then at Diane, then at me. "I don't understand why legal needs to be involved in a standard performance review. David's attendance has been out." Thomas cut him off. "Let's be very specific about dates and times. On October 20th, David informed you his father had terminal cancer. On November 2nd, he informed you his father was in hospice. On November 9th, at 11:43 p.m., he informed you his father had passed away and that the funeral would be on November 15th at 2 p.m. Is that accurate?" Gerald shifted in his chair. "Yes, but employees are expected to maintain their professional commitments even during personal difficulties. David has a history of Thomas held up a hand. "On November 10th, you scheduled a mandatory performance review for November 15th at 2 p.m., the exact time of the funeral. Why?" Gerald's face flushed. "That was the time slot available in my calendar. If David had a conflict, he should have communicated that clearly." I felt my jaw clench. Diane spoke before I could. "He did communicate it. He sent you the funeral home details, the obituary link, and 3 separate emails confirming the service time. You have a copy of all that information." Gerald waved a hand, dismissively. "I receive hundreds of emails a day. I can't be expected to cross-reference every personal event with every scheduled meeting. If David needed the meeting rescheduled, he should have done so through the proper channels." Thomas Ashford pulled out his phone and started reading directly from the screen. Email from Gerald Thornton, sent November 15th at 2:03 p.m. "David, you missed our performance review. This is unacceptable." Email sent at 2:15 p.m. "I've noted your absence in your file. We'll need to discuss this pattern of deprioritizing company commitments." Email sent at 2:47 p.m. "I've rescheduled your review for tomorrow morning at 8 a.m. This is mandatory. Failure to attend will result in formal disciplinary action." Mr. Thornton, at 2:03 p.m. on November 15th, David was delivering his father's eulogy. You knew this. You had written confirmation of this, and you sent him emails threatening his employment for not attending a meeting scheduled during his father's funeral. The room went very quiet. Gerald's face had gone from flushed to pale. I didn't intend." Thomas leaned forward. "What exactly didn't you intend? The scheduling conflict? The threatening emails? The disciplinary action? Because from where I'm sitting, this looks like intentional harassment of an employee during a protected bereavement period, which violates both company policy and California labor law." Gerald stood up abruptly. "I don't have to listen to this. My management decisions are not subject to legal review unless there's clear evidence of discrimination or oh." Diane's voice was ice. "Sit down, Gerald. We're not done." He sat. She continued. "This isn't the first time your management practices have raised concerns. Priya Sharma's mother had a stroke, and you asked her to work remotely from the hospital. James Kowalski requested paternity leave, and you gave him a negative review. David Thompson has 8 years of exemplary performance, And you've scheduled 3 performance reviews in the past 6 weeks, all during times when he'd clearly communicated personal emergencies. Thomas took over. He started pulling up emails on the conference room screen, projecting them for everyone to see. Let's go through this systematically. March 23rd, you scheduled a performance review during David's anniversary dinner. He'd put it on the team calendar 4 weeks in advance. You scheduled the review anyway and told him, "Ow." Thomas read from the email, "Ow, I need flexibility in my calendar. If you can't accommodate that, maybe you're not as committed as I thought." Is that accurate? Gerald didn't answer. Thomas continued. April 19th, David's wife had emergency surgery. He took 2 days off. When he returned, you called him into your office to express concern about recent absences. The email you sent after that meeting stated that frequent personal issues were impacting team morale. September 8th, David's father was hospitalized. You called him at 11:30 p.m. on a Friday night demanding he fix a production bug. He was at the hospital. He left his dying father's bedside to work on your issue. Did you know he was at the hospital? Gerald's jaw tightened. He didn't tell me. I spoke for the first time. My voice was surprisingly steady. I did tell you. I sent you a Slack message at 7:15 p.m. that evening. Gerald, I'm at the hospital with my father. He's been admitted with complications. I'll have my phone on me if anything urgent comes up, but I won't be able to access my laptop until tomorrow. You responded at 7:23 p.m. Noted. Then you called me at 11:30 p.m. anyway. Thomas projected the Slack conversation on the screen. There it was, exactly as I'd remembered it. Gerald stared at the screen, and I watched him realize he'd been caught in a lie. Diane picked up where Thomas left off. Let's talk about the pattern of performance reviews. In the 8 years before you arrived, David had annual performance reviews, standard company policy. In the 18 months since you became VP, he's had 11 performance reviews. 11. That's 1 every 6 weeks. Why? Gerald cleared his throat. David's performance required closer monitoring. He was falling behind. Oh, now. Diane cut him off. David's performance reviews before you arrived were exemplary. I have all of them here. Exceeds expectations. Valuable team member. Strong technical skills and leadership. Then you arrive, and suddenly he needs improvement in areas that were never mentioned before. His work didn't change. Your evaluation did. Why? Gerald's hands were clenched on the table. I have higher standards than previous management. That's what I was brought in to do. Raise the bar, improve performance across the board. Thomas jumped back in. Higher standards that only seem to apply to certain employees. Let's talk about Priya Sharma. Mother had a stroke on June 3rd. You called her 4 hours later asking if she could work remotely from the hospital. When she declined, you put a note in her file about prioritizing personal matters over team obligations. James Kowalski, paternity leave in August. You gave him the legal minimum and then marked him down on his quarterly review for extended absence during critical project phase. Jennifer Wu, her daughter, was in a car accident in September. She took emergency leave. You scheduled a performance review the day she returned to discuss her concerning pattern of unavailability. Do you see the pattern here, Mr. Thornton? The silence that followed was suffocating. Gerald opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again. Finally, he said, I expect commitment from my team. If people can't separate their personal lives from their professional responsibilities, then maybe they're not the right fit for this company. And that was the moment he lost. I saw it in Thomas's face, in Diane's posture, in the way they exchanged a look that needed no words. Gerald had just explicitly stated that he expected employees to prioritize work over dying parents, medical emergencies, and newborn children. He'd said it out loud, on record, in front of corporate counsel and the HR director. Thomas leaned back in his chair, and I swear I saw the faintest hint of a smile. Mr. Thornton, California law provides protected leave for family medical emergencies, bereavement, and parental bonding. Federal law protects employees from retaliation for taking that leave. Company policy, which you signed acknowledgement of when you were hired, explicitly states that Stratford Analytics supports work-life balance and recognizes that employees have lives and responsibilities outside of work. You have systematically violated all 3 of those standards. You've created a hostile work environment. You've retaliated against employees for taking legally protected leave. You've documented your violations in email, in Slack, and in performance reviews. Do you understand the legal exposure you've created for this company? Gerald's face went pale again. I was doing my job. I was managing my team. If that's created some misunderstandings, then I apologize. But I don't think Diane cut him off. This meeting is over. You're being placed on immediate administrative leave pending a full investigation. Thomas will walk you through the process. You need to pack your personal items and leave the building within the hour. You're not to contact any employees during the investigation. Do you understand? The meeting lasted another 90 minutes, but that was the real ending. The moment Gerald Thornton realized he'd miscalculated badly. Thomas asked questions. Gerald provided answers that got progressively less coherent. Diane took notes. I sat there, exhausted and furious, and vindicated all at once. Watching a man who'd held power over my career for 18 months slowly realize he'd destroyed his own. The legal terminology started flying: hostile work environment, constructive dismissal, emotional distress, retaliation, FEHA violations. Gerald tried to claim he was just maintaining high standards. Thomas produced emails from other employees. Apparently, I wasn't the first person to complain to HR about Gerald's tactics. Priya had filed a complaint 3 months ago. James had filed one before leaving the company. There were 6 other complaints, all describing similar patterns: demands during family emergencies, threats for not being available enough, performance reviews, scheduled during medical procedures, vacations, and personal crises. Diane had been building a file. She'd been waiting for something concrete enough to act on. My documentation was the final piece. Gerald Thornton was placed on immediate administrative leave at 10:15 a.m. Thomas informed him he'd be receiving a formal notice of investigation. Diane walked him to his office, supervised him packing his personal items, and escorted him out of the building. The whole department watched through the glass walls as the VP of Technology, the man who'd terrorized us for 18 months, carried a cardboard box of belongings past the desks of people he'd threatened and humiliated. Priya caught my eye as he walked past. She mouthed 2 words: "Thank you." The investigation took 3 weeks. Thomas Ashford hired an external firm that specialized in workplace conduct reviews. Keller Associates, based in Los Angeles, led by Dr. Rebecca Keller, PhD in organizational psychology, 26 years, conducting workplace investigations for Fortune 500 companies. They interviewed 23 employees. They reviewed 5 years of emails, Slack messages, calendar invitations, and performance reviews. They documented patterns. Gerald had scheduled performance reviews during employee vacations, medical procedures, religious holidays, and family emergencies for 15 different people. He'd given negative reviews to anyone who'd taken more than 3 days off in a quarter. He'd created a hostile environment where people felt they had to choose between their personal lives and their jobs. The firm's report was 87 pages long. I got a redacted copy. The conclusions were damning. Mr. Thornton's management practices demonstrate a systematic pattern of harassment, particularly targeting employees during vulnerable personal circumstances. His actions created a hostile work environment, violated multiple company policies, and exposed Stratford Analytics to significant legal liability. We recommend immediate termination and implementation of mandatory management training for all supervisory staff. Gerald Thornton was officially terminated on December 8th. No severance package, no recommendation letter, no chance of return. The company sent an all-staff email. Effective immediately, Gerald Thornton is no longer with Stratford Analytics. We take workplace conduct seriously and are committed to maintaining an environment of respect and support. If you have experienced similar treatment, please contact HR immediately. Within 24 hours, 3 more people came forward with complaints. Within a week, the company had hired an interim VP and started implementing policy changes. But the investigation revealed something else, something that made the whole situation even more disturbing. Dr. Keller's team discovered that Gerald had kept personal notes about employees, or not official performance documentation, but handwritten notes in a notebook he kept in his desk drawer. They found it when they were collecting his personal items. The notebook contained entries about nearly everyone on the tech team. Priya's entry: mother's stroke, June 3rd. Could be useful leverage if performance issues arise. Note: seems emotionally vulnerable. James's entry: new father, August. Sleep deprived, likely to make mistakes. Watch for opportunities to document underperformance. My entry, dated October 21st, the day after I'd told Gerald about my father's cancer diagnosis. Father terminal. Will be distracted, emotional, potentially absent. Document all performance issues carefully. Could justify PIP if needed. PIP meant performance improvement. Plan now, HR code for, we're building a case to fire you. Gerald had been planning to use my father's death as grounds for termination. He'd been waiting for me to slip up, documenting everything, building a case. The notebook had 38 pages of similar entries. It read like a predator's hunting. Journal, tracking employees' vulnerabilities, and planning how to exploit them. Dr. Keller's supplemental report called it one of the most disturbing examples of predatory management practices I've encountered in my career. Thomas later told me that notebook alone would have been grounds for immediate termination, even without everything else. The company implemented mandatory changes. Every manager had to complete 40 hours of training on compassionate leadership, legal obligations regarding protected leave, and recognizing harassment. HR established a direct reporting line for management complaints that bypassed the normal chain of command. They hired an ombudsman, Dr. Patricia Okafor, workplace mediator with 15 years at Stanford University's Conflict Resolution Center, to provide confidential support for employees dealing with management issues. They revised the performance review policy, no more than 2 reviews per year unless there were documented performance issues, requiring intervention, and those required HR sign-off. They established a bereavement leave policy that actually meant something: 5 days minimum for immediate family, with extensions available upon request, and an explicit prohibition on work contact during bereavement leave unless the employee initiates it. They created a right to disconnect policy: no emails or calls expected outside of business hours unless explicitly part of an on-call rotation with compensation. The changes were real, substantial, and enforced. 3 months later, a junior manager tried to schedule a meeting during an employee's medical leave. HR found out within 24 hours and put the manager on probation. The message was clear. Gerald's behavior would not be tolerated anymore, at any level. I took 2 more weeks off after the investigation concluded. Actual bereavement leave, not the 3 days I'd originally been granted. I spent time with my mother, helping her sort through Dad's belongings, handling the estate paperwork, just being present. She'd aged 10 years in the past 6 months, grief etched into every line of her face. We went through Dad's workshop together, deciding what to keep and what to donate. His tools, carefully organized and maintained, still smelled like machine oil and metal shavings. Mom touched each one like it was sacred. "He was proud of you," she said, holding Dad's favorite wrench. "He bragged about you to everyone. You know that, right?" I did know. But I also knew that pride had been complicated by my absence in his final weeks, the times I'd chosen work over being with him because I was afraid of Gerald's retaliation. Mom saw the guilt in my face. "David, he understood. He worked his whole life. He knew what it meant to have a boss breathing down your neck. He just wanted you to stand up for yourself when it mattered." "I did," I said. "Eventually." She smiled. "Better late than never. And you made sure it couldn't happen to anyone else. That matters." Diane called me personally to approve the extended leave. "Take whatever time you need, David. You've earned it, and frankly, we owe you." When I came back in January, things had changed. The new interim VP, Catherine Brennan, came from a competitor where she'd been CTO for 7 years. First day, she sent an email to the entire tech department. "I believe in sustainable excellence aroused doing great work without burning people out. I believe work is important, but so is everything else in your life. I believe in treating people like adults who care about their jobs and their teams. If you need time off, take it. If you have a family emergency, handle it. If you're struggling, talk to me. We're going to build something great here, and we're going to do it without destroying ourselves in the process." People were skeptical at first. We'd heard corporate speak before, but Catherine backed it up with actions. First week, she canceled 3 standing meetings that existed, only because Gerald had demanded them. Second week, she implemented no meeting Fridays, so people could have time for deep work. Third week, someone's kid got sick, and Catherine personally covered their work so they could take the day off without scrambling. She pulled me aside on my first day back. "I've reviewed your file. 8 years of excellent performance, multiple successful projects, consistently positive peer reviews. I don't know what Thornton's problem was, but it wasn't you. We'd like to discuss a promotion and a raise. You've more than earned it." The promotion came through in February. Senior lead developer, 23% raise, stock options, direct report only to Catherine instead of through a hostile middle manager. But more than the title or the money, it was the conversation Catherine had with me when she offered it. "David, I read the Keller report. I read Gerald's notebook. I read what he wrote about you, about planning to use your father's death to justify firing you. That's not management. That's sociopathy. I want you to know that kind of behavior has no place here, not anymore. You're valuable to this company, not just because of your technical skills, but because you stood up when it mattered. You documented everything. You went through proper channels. You probably saved a dozen other people from what you went through. That's leadership, and that's why I'm promoting you." She paused. "I also want you to know that if you ever feel like any manager here is crossing a line, you have my personal cell number. You call me directly. No bureaucracy, no chain of command. You call me, and we handle it immediately. Deal?" We shook hands. For the first time in 18 months, I felt like I was working for a company that actually valued me as a human being, not just a resource to be exploited. Priya got promoted too, to senior developer, with a similar raise and Catherine's personal promise of support. She came to my desk the day the promotions were announced and just hugged me. "I was going to quit," she said. "I had a resignation letter written. I was going to turn it in the day after Gerald got fired. I couldn't take it anymore. My mom almost died, and he treated it like an inconvenience, like I was being dramatic by wanting to be at the hospital. You standing up to him saved my job, maybe my sanity. Thank you." I didn't know what to say to that. I'd fought for myself, but apparently, I'd fought for everyone else too. James got a call from HR in February. Thomas Ashford personally apologized and offered him his job back with a significant raise, full back pay for the time he'd been gone, and Catherine's promise that the culture had changed. James declined. He'd found a better position and didn't want to risk coming back to a toxic environment. But he told me later that the apology meant something. At least they acknowledged they were wrong. That's more than most companies would do. The company implemented new policies, mandatory training for all managers on compassionate leave, stricter oversight of performance review scheduling, anonymous reporting system for management issues, quarterly surveys about workplace environment. It didn't fix everything, but it was something. The real ending came 3 months later, in March, when I got an email from a lawyer I'd never heard of. Kenneth Reeves, employment litigation specialist with Reeves & Partners LLP in San Francisco, wanted to know if I'd be willing to provide testimony in a class action lawsuit against Gerald Thornton's previous employer. Apparently, I wasn't his first victim. The Silicon Valley startup that had burned through $60 million had also burned through employees, with Gerald as the primary flame. 15 people were suing for wrongful termination, harassment, and emotional distress. The lead plaintiff was a woman named Angela Romano, who'd been fired 2 days after she returned from maternity leave. Gerald had documented her decreased productivity and lack of commitment in performance reviews conducted while she was legally protected from termination. The parallels to my case were disturbing. Angela had also documented everything. She had emails showing Gerald had scheduled mandatory meetings during her scheduled breastfeeding breaks. She had performance reviews that contradicted each other monthly. She had Slack messages where Gerald had publicly questioned her dedication to the team after she'd left work at 6 p.m. to pick up her infant from daycare. She had a notebook entry. Gerald apparently kept similar documentation at his previous job that read, "New mother, will prioritize baby over work, document performance issues, likely won't fight termination due to new parent stress." Kenneth Reeves called me directly 2 days after the initial email. "Mr. Thompson, I've reviewed the documentation you provided to Stratford Analytics during their internal investigation. Thomas, Ashford was kind enough to share it with your permission. Your case is almost identical to what we're seeing in California. Gerald Thornton has a pattern spanning 3 companies in 8 years. He targets people during vulnerable moments. New parents, people dealing with sick family members, employees with medical issues. And he uses their circumstances against them. He documents everything, builds files, and then either forces them out or makes their lives so miserable they quit. You're the first person who fought back successfully while still employed. That's huge for our case." I asked why it mattered. Kenneth's voice got serious. "Because you have documentation of his pattern before it got to termination. Everyone else in the lawsuit was fired or quit. You have evidence of the hunting behavior, the predatory documentation, the systematic harassment, all while you were still employed. You prove it wasn't just about poor performance or bad fit out. It was deliberate. Targeting of vulnerable employees. Your case makes our case stronger, and it might prevent him from doing this to someone else." My documentation became part of a larger pattern of abuse spanning 3 companies and 8 years. Kenneth told me on the phone, "Guys like Thornton move from company to company, leaving destruction in their wake because nobody documents it properly. You documented everything. You built a case. You probably saved a dozen other people from going through what you went through." I gave a deposition in April. It took 6 hours. Kenneth walked me through every email, every calendar invitation, every Slack message. He asked me about my father's death, about the funeral, about standing in that parking lot reading Gerald's threatening emails. He asked me about the notebook entry, about learning Gerald had planned to use my grief as grounds for termination. He asked me how it felt to know my boss had seen my father's terminal diagnosis as useful leverage. I answered every question truthfully. By the end, I was exhausted, but I also felt lighter somehow. This wasn't just about me anymore. This was about making sure Gerald couldn't do this to anyone else. The opposing counsel tried to paint me as a disgruntled employee looking for a payout. They asked if I'd been having performance issues before my father's diagnosis. They implied I was using my father's death to excuse poor work. They suggested I'd fabricated or exaggerated Gerald's behavior. Kenneth shut it down with documentation. He had my 8 years of exemplary reviews before Gerald arrived. He had emails from clients praising my work. He had testimony from Catherine Brennan stating I was one of the most valuable developers on the team. He had Gerald's own notebook proving premeditation. The opposing counsel switched tactics and tried to settle. The lawsuit settled in June for an undisclosed amount. Kenneth couldn't tell me the exact number due to confidentiality agreements, but he said it was significant enough to send a message. More importantly, the settlement included non-monetary terms. Gerald Thornton was required to undergo professional evaluation and management training before he could hold any supervisory position again. His employment record would permanently include the findings of workplace harassment and hostile environment creation. Any future employer conducting background checks would see red flags. Kenneth called me when the settlement was finalized. "David, you need to understand what you've accomplished here. 15 people got justice. Gerald's career in management is effectively over. And most importantly, you've created a paper trail that will protect other employees. When the next company considers hiring him, they'll find the lawsuit. They'll find the settlement terms. They'll think twice. You didn't just save yourself. You saved people you'll never meet from going through what you went through. That meant more to me than any settlement money could have. My father had raised me to stand up for what was right, even when it was hard, especially when it was hard. I'd finally done that, and it had mattered. Gerald tried to fight the settlement terms. He hired his own lawyer and filed an appeal, claiming the non-monetary terms were professionally destructive and prevented him from earning a living. The judge denied the appeal in August. The ruling was scathing. Mr. Thornton's documented pattern of deliberately targeting vulnerable employees, maintaining predatory documentation of their personal circumstances, and systematically using protected leave as grounds for termination demonstrates a fundamental unsuitability for supervisory positions. The settlement terms are not punitive. They are protective of future potential victims. Mr. Thornton's ability to earn a living is not impaired. His ability to harm others through management positions is appropriately restricted. The ruling was public record. Kenneth sent me a copy. I read it 3 times. A federal judge had essentially called Gerald a predator and ruled that protecting employees was more important than protecting his career. That was justice, real justice, the kind that didn't happen often enough in the real world. I visit my father's grave every few weeks. I tell him about work, about the promotion, about standing up to Gerald. I tell him that the business card in his wallet meant something, that the career he was proud of turned out to be worth fighting for. I tell him that he raised me to stand up for myself, to document everything, to never let bullies win just because they have authority. Sometimes I think about that moment in the funeral home parking lot, staring at that calendar notification, feeling trapped between grief and fear. I think about how close I came to just accepting it, to showing up to that performance review, to letting Gerald's abuse continue because I was too tired and too sad to fight back. I'm glad I fought. I'm glad I documented. I'm glad I walked into Diane's office with evidence instead of just complaints. Dad would have been proud of that too. The methodical approach, the careful preparation, the refusal to back down when I knew I was right. The business card in his wallet said Senior Developer. Now it would say Senior Lead Developer. Small difference in words, huge difference in what it represented. It represented a company that finally decided to protect its employees instead of its toxic managers. It represented justice, the slow, bureaucratic kind that doesn't make for dramatic movie moments but actually works in the real world. And it represented something Dad had always told me. Son, you don't have to be the loudest voice in the room. You just have to be the one who's right and who refuses to quit. I wasn't the loudest voice at Stratford Analytics, but I was right, and I didn't quit, and that made all the difference. If you enjoyed this, definitely want to see the next ones too. So subscribe now and let me know your take in the comments.